Good morning. If you have a Bible, go ahead and turn to Luke chapter 24. We'll read there, picking up in verse 15 in just a moment. But it's great to see everyone on this extra bright Lord's Day. We had a work day yesterday, so the room's a little brighter after the changing of the bulbs, and I can maybe see my notes a little better now. But it was a wonderful experience to get to come together and just such an efficient process. And it was amazing to me, like everyone getting to work together to accomplish something, which is really just symbolic of what we're doing every day, all the time as a church. We all have our different roles, our different tasks. We're all functioning as one unified body, but we all have some important part to play in making, maybe we could say, this whole world a little brighter. Luke 24. If I were to ask you what is the most symbolic of the four Gospels, which one would you choose? My guess is that you would go to John, and I would probably agree with you. John's probably the most symbolic of the four gospel accounts. And when we read John, it's not difficult to see that. Our minds are kind of trained to think that way. For example, when Christ appears in this post-resurrection scene with Mary Magdalene in this garden, it's easy for us to think back to, oh, that's much like Adam and Eve in the garden. And therefore, this is a symbolic way of thinking about Christ and the new Adam and the new Eve, the bride of Christ, which is the church. We're kind of used to reading the Gospel of John in that kind of symbolic lens. But when it comes to the Gospel of Luke, at least for me, I tend to read that more as a purely historical account. That's kind of how I thought of it growing up. At the very beginning of Luke, he says, "I've written this to you, most excellent Theophilus, as an orderly account of the things that have taken place." And so in my mind, I thought that just means a pure historical, just the facts alone, just the details, event by event, telling us what happened. And if we read it that way, we could get something out of it. But what I want us to see is that Luke is meant to be read no different in many ways from the Gospel of John. That we're to see these stories and these images and these moments with that same lens of seeing the symbolism and the metaphor of how Christ relates to us as the church today. And so with that in mind, what we'll see in this particular section is I want us to ask this question, that as these disciples encounter the risen Jesus, what might this say about how we should expect to encounter the risen Jesus today? So let's jump in to Luke 24, beginning in verse 13. It says, "That very day, two of them were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they were talking with each other about all these things that had happened. And while they were talking and discussing together, Jesus himself drew near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, 'What is this conversation that you're holding with each other as you walk?' And they stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, named Cleopas, answered him, and he said, 'Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that have happened there in these days?' And he said to them, 'What things?' And they said to him, 'Concerning Jesus of Nazareth, a man who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people. And how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped. We had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things happened. Moreover, some women of our company amazed us. They were at the tomb early in the morning, And when they did not find his body, they came back saying that they had seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. And some of those who were with us went to the tomb, and they found it just as the women had said. But him they did not see. And he said to them, O foolish ones and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So they drew near to the village to which they were going, and he acted as if he was going to go further. But they urged him strongly, saying, Stay with us, for it is toward evening, and day is now far spent. So he went in to stay with them. And when he was at the table with them, he took the bread, and he blessed it, and he broke it, and he gave it to them. And their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. And they said to each other, Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road, while he opened to us the scriptures? And they rose that same hour and returned to Jerusalem. This is an amazing moment, and I've always wondered, what was it that they were expecting? Here, after their Lord was crucified, dead, and buried, their hopes are dashed. They're filled with sorrow. And did you notice this time? I didn't notice this until this week, but they're walking alongside, and then when Jesus asks about what happened, they stood still. Have you ever come to a moment in your own life where everything just stops? They just stood still. This was a moment of despair and sorrow and hopelessness. But what was it that they were expecting? They seem to have some idea in mind. They recall something about Jesus promising that he would rise again. But what was it that they had in mind as far as how he would return? Maybe they expected that Jesus would return in some universally apparent way, that with a dash of splendor and glory, he would just make himself universally apparent for everyone to see all at once, therefore proving that he really is the Son of God. Or maybe they had this expectation that Jesus would go to the temple and he would appear with those nail-scarred hands before the people who crucified him, before the Sanhedrin and the religious elite, and he would say, Look at me now. Now do you believe? Now do you know who I really am? Or maybe they thought that he would march straight to Rome with a heavenly host, with an angelic army marching in line behind him to finally redeem Israel from the hand of their oppressor. Maybe that's what they had in mind, that he would finally redeem Israel in this way. But whatever the case may be, I imagine that they at least thought that he would appear to them. That in some way or another, these are not just fringe disciples. These are not just extras in the story. They're front and center, walking alongside Jesus throughout his 3 years of ministry. And surely, they thought, surely by now he would have made himself known to us if he really had risen. And maybe that's a thought that you can relate to this morning. Maybe you have wondered, surely, as I'm a follower of Jesus, surely he would make himself known to me in some way. But how is it that you expect Jesus to show up in your life, in your everyday walk? On one hand, maybe you don't expect to encounter Jesus at all. And maybe that's somewhat of a view that I had growing up, that I believed that Jesus had risen from the dead, that he ascended into glory, but that he was still kind of just remote and distant. That like the clockmaker who set everything in motion, just kind of took his hands away to let things run its course. It's believing that he's alive, but that belief is as ineffective as those disciples thinking that he was dead. Just like them, we don't expect to see him and to know him in any real and meaningful and practical way. And so like his body was missing from that tomb, we believe that Jesus is absent until we see him in heaven. And that might be something like where you're coming from this morning. But on the other hand, maybe you do expect to encounter Jesus, but in a particular way. That you have some expectation, and maybe it's not unlike the disciples, that you expect Jesus to come and appear in some dash of splendor and glory, that the only way that you anticipate his presence and his active role in your life is if there's some miraculous-like moment in this crystal clear way that he's right before you. That he has to appear before you in some powerful way for it to sink in that his presence is actually near, that we have this kind of expectation that this is the way he should show up in my life. But notice, how does Jesus show up here? First of all, verse 15, it says that as they were walking along the way, talking about everything that happened, he drew near and went with them. He drew near and went with them. The Bible describes Jesus' risen and glorified body as being universalized, alive and at large in every place and time. But his presence is not always manifest in a blaze of glory. Rather, he appears here in this light-footed companionship. He draws near in this gentle and quiet and almost imperceptible way. And he just walks with them. And it's beautiful. It reminds me of the story of Elijah at Mount Horeb, when after the victory at Mount Carmel, Jezebel sends her people to track him down, and he comes to Mount Horeb, and he is distraught, and he's broken, and he's sorrowful. And then up top this mountain comes this fire and this earthquake and this storm, and God's not found in the earthquake or the fire or the storm. But then, do you remember where he's found? It says, in the sound of a gentle blowing. Of like this gentle wind, this gentle spirit. And so by his death and resurrection, Jesus' presence becomes universalized, so that just as God walked alongside Adam and Eve in the cool of the day, Jesus draws near and he walks alongside us. Not always in these grand appearances or in miraculous ways, the way that we might define miraculous, but in these often small and imperceptible ways to the untrained eye. He's beside you not only in the good times, but in the bad, in the heartache and in the hopelessness. And what the resurrection means is that no matter how dark the circumstances might seem, just as it was for those two disciples, Jesus draws near and he goes with us. But the problem is that we don't always recognize him. Just like these two disciples, our eyes are often blinded from seeing his gentle, quiet, light-footed companionship in our lives. But did you notice the place and the presence where his glory becomes real to them? Verse 29 says, when he was at the table with them, he took the bread and he blessed it and he broke it and he gave it to them. And their eyes were opened and they knew him. And so Luke is showing us that Jesus is risen from the dead, and we should therefore expect him to draw near to us and walk with us through life in sudden, often imperceptible ways. But then there's this table. And the idea is that at this table, the often imperceptible presence of Jesus becomes so concentrated and so potent that we, in a very real sense, feel his body and taste his blood. Through his presence, often that slips by unnoticed, we draw near and prove in this kind of unmistakable way that he's right here with us in the breaking of the bread. And sometimes maybe that's strange for us to think of it that way, and we're hesitant to use language of literal in this case, but there's something that Luke is pointing us to, that as the disciples walk along the road and they're unaware to that imperceptible of Jesus walking by their side, when they come to the table, when they come to the breaking of the bread, there's something so real and potent and unmistakable about that bread that is his body and that juice that is his blood. And all of a sudden it's unmistakable. And it's right before their eyes. And it seems like what we do here on Sunday, as we break this bread and our eyes are open to experience and encounter Jesus in this very real way, it is to train our eye to see him as we walk along the way in our everyday life. That this moment around the table trains our eye to see him drawing near and going with us as we walk to the place that we're going. And so in closing, there's a song that I think captures all this so well that we sing. It says, "Softly, so softly, you come in the silence, and you gather each prayer in your hand. Then so gently, revealing your beauty, your glory you spread across the land. Softly, so softly, you come here beside me, and you lift my heart heavy with sin. Then so gently, you cleanse all its pieces until I am pure and whole again. Peace is not in the thunder that rolls across the mountains. It's not in the lightning, the rain you release, but deep in communion is mercy and comfort. And within your presence, there is peace." At this time, we'll ask the men to come forward as we partake.